Thank you, Dr. Geeta, again. My question was around the mention of social democracy or social emancipation before economic emancipation and Ambedkar's issues with the socialists. In Annihilation of Caste, he does mention the transition of Europe from feudal to an industrial system that actually was preceded by reforms in the church. Would you be able to shed any light on whether the Marxists and the socialists assume that this is a given and hence do not touch upon it, or they do not have historical context of it?
This is an important question. I will address it at length in my lectures on socialism and Ambedkar. But for now, I want us to notice that Ambedkar did not sort of think in that sort of stagist fashion that formal communist thought sometimes proceeds in. That you have certain stages of history which sort of accommodate older social formations, but move on dialectically to the next stage. Ambedkar sort of felt that was not enough the way it was understood, that you can still remain, parts of your society can remain at a certain stage which has not been transcended at all, and that then restructures the present also in very important ways. Therefore, for him, caste was not something that's been transcended and cannot be transcended only from an economic point of view. So caste is also religious faith, caste is also social relations. So unlike the Marxists who thought caste was a part of a feudal system which would go with the coming of bourgeois industrial life, he did not think that was the case. Caste had actually shaped bourgeois industrial life itself in the Indian context. So therefore, for him, the fight against caste and private property and religion all had to be simultaneously done. Now, when he references European history, when he talks of the revolution and the Reformation, the revolution in the church and the Reformation of Martin Luther as preceding political change, he basically wants us to think through the possibilities of thinking of new worldviews that would accompany the demand for wholesale economic and social transformation. Now, the socialist worldview, imagine that the socialist worldview was enough to do that. But for Ambedkar, that was not enough. The socialist worldview in India had to have a very conscious anti-caste and a critical religious agenda. And he felt that the communists were not thinking enough about it. And as we shall see, they did not pay any attention to it, any or not sufficient attention to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So my question was the last statement, Dr. Geeta, you were saying, right? We cannot make a law to enforce the person.
Yeah, you cannot ask a person to love another person through law. That's what I said. That's what Ambedkar says.
So my question is, what is Ambedkar's thought? How to make it happen, and what is your understanding? How do we ensure, encourage the other person to love the another person in our personal thought? Right, we are generating the awareness. We are asking the people to consider everybody equal, some other moment, everything. But at the end of the day, it has to ignite from somebody's heart, right? So what is
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah. So Ambedkar thought of it along several lines. One was, of course, what I've been saying in my earlier classes: stay within Hinduism and see if all of us can be better, different, radical Hindus. That's something he does up to a certain point. Then he, of course, says it's not going to work with Hinduism. One has to get out of Hinduism, form another sort of social grouping where we agree to abide by certain principles on the basis of which we shall respect and love each other, right? That's something he does with Annihilation of Caste. So at different points in his life, he's thinking of both the social and conceptual conditions that you have to create, but he also realizes that that change has to be internalized. And how is that to be internalized, which is what brings him to Buddhism at the end. It's not simply through ideas, but also through the way you live in the everyday. And which is why he takes his ethical turn to Buddhism towards the end of his life. We'll, of course, talk about it again. And the wholesale change in value systems, which you have to adopt in terms of how you lead your life itself.
Okay. My continuous same to the topic. I have another question. Like, say, being Hindu, and it's not that everybody's choice to change the religion to Buddhism or other religions, right? So being in Hindu only, and how do we make sure that we can make the other people to love each other? Is there
So,
any thought he has
well,
proposed?
Ambedkar does not think that there's anything redemptive within Hinduism, but he does not also foreclose the option of people debating. At the end of Annihilation of Caste, he tells his audience, who are largely Hindus, that I don't think Hinduism is capable of democracy or liberty or equality or fraternity. But if you are to rethink your Hinduism along these terms, chances are your religion could be something that we could hope to consider seriously. So he doesn't block off conversation or leave hope. So while he might reject Hinduism, much like Periyar did, he never blocked out the possibilities of people rethinking their own value systems and coming into an equal, just, and fraternal world.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Dr. Gita.
One of the things I keep hearing from, I heard in your speech, in your talk today, but also from various Dalit leaders, is our focus on annihilation of caste. Why is it our focus? Dr. Ambedkar, like you just answered Kali, said that that's not my job. And in fact, in his conclusion, he says that he's going to sit on the side, get popcorn, and watch Hindus try to even reform it if they could. So why are we still constantly focusing as if that's our task? And why don't we, in the same year, he proposed path to salvation? Why don't we focus on that? Why are we still stuck with annihilation of caste as if it's our duty to help the Hindus? They can clean up or not, their problem.
Yes, thank you. That's an important question, but I think Ambedkar himself would like to think of that in a dialectical fashion. Yes, annihilation of caste is something that the caste Hindu has to think about. And he always felt untouchability was a caste Hindu problem. It's not the untouchables problem. So remaking, rethinking, or doing away with the caste order is something that has to come from the caste Hindu point of view. But for him, as long as the caste Hindu doesn't do that, the structures of oppression are not going to go away. So what path to salvation is a dialectical counter to annihilation of caste. But unless Buddhism is widely accepted as a way of being and a way of life, you can not expect that the structures of oppression and the modes of exploitation, socially, economically, or religiously, will vanish. Dalits can have a very self-respecting, a very rich universe of being in which Dalits participate equally with each other. And the importance of that cannot be sort of downgraded or considered less than anything. But at the same time, for Ambedkar, that would never nearly be enough. At the end of his life, let's not forget he wanted to form another political party, the Republican Party. So for him, that dialectic had to go on in different ways. Now, the pace of that dialectic, I don't think he felt one could insist on that, you stop with this and then you start with that. That's something that only history can decide. And maybe we can think of this in terms of how there have been these different points of view within African American circles as well. There's always been a sort of inward looking thing of let's just build African American resources, worldviews, Black Lives Matter in a very central sense. But there's also been a push outwards into challenging the worldviews of those who refuse to change and for thinking of a more universal option. Dr. King himself thought that way. So I think these are worldviews that will continue to be contentiously engaged with each other. And for Ambedkar, certainly either the one or the other was not the solution.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening, ma'am. My question is, how much was he able to push the envelope within the Hindu civil code to accommodate rights of oppressed classes? He, of course, recognized religious minorities. So within the Hindu code, how was he able to accommodate? That's number one. And number two, can you also comment on how the subsequent works under Dr. Annadurai was also necessary to complement the efforts that Ambedkar had done? Thank you.
Yeah. The Hindu Civil Code it's a very long and complicated history. Ambedkar came to that civil code debate towards the end of that history, so to speak, because it goes back to the setting up of the Hindu Law Committee in 1932, through various stages of reform and changes in law suggested by a lot of actually Indian women in terms of changes to the law in marriage and divorce and property and so on. What Ambedkar did was very singular. That is, he felt it was not enough to have these laws which would transform the inner life of Indian society. And that's important. Go back to my lecture 2 for that, because the inner life of Indian society is where caste breeds and lives in intimate lives and conjugal relations. So he wanted to sort of bring these various legal reform options that had been suggested over a period of time into a code where they would stay and be sort of a complete guarantee for those who wish to challenge endogamy, those who wish to go against caste rules and so on. In the event that did not happen for various reasons, the Hindu Code Bill got shunted out of the Constituent Assembly legislative debates. And later on, these laws were passed piecemeal. So today, while you have guarantees that will enable you contract an intercaste marriage or a marriage against endogamy, that is not something that is part of the constitutional directive of the state to endorse and support. So that is, I think, the importance of Ambedkar's insistence on a code. Sadly, that did not happen. What you have are amendments. So if you take something like, say, the self-respect marriage in Tamil Nadu, which a law was passed endorsing the self-respect marriage, but if you look at the letter of the law, it's an amendment to the Hindu Marriage Act. So you're forced to remain within the framework of the Hindu view of things, whereas if you had had the Hindu Code Bill, you would have had a more civil view of things, which is something we did not have. Now, as to the work that was done after Ambedkar's time, I think a number of inspirational things from Ambedkar, from Periyar, from many of the anti-caste thinkers and activists in our own time have been taken over into legislation, taken over into government policies in different parts of India, including Tamil Nadu, of course. And I think something like the amendment to the Hindu Marriage Act, the Self-Respect Marriage Act that was passed is one of those things. The enduring importance of reservation in different parts of India also owes to the tradition that that Ambedkar, Periyar, and Phule and others were part of, and the continuing emphasis by parties like the Bahujan Samaj Party, by various other political parties on Bahujan Dalit presence in political society also is part of this tradition.
Thank you.
Dr. Geeta, today during the lecture today, you said that British were only interested in maintaining their hegemony and not interested in caste fairness. If that were so, they wouldn't have brought some of the legislations that they brought, like Sati and so on. Not only that, they wouldn't have provided a fair platform to Dr. Ambedkar, wherein they could hear and provide a kind of be a fair jury. I would like to hear what you think on that.
Yeah, I'm actually drawing my own observations entirely on Dr. Ambedkar's understanding of British rule. While he sort of welcomed the rule of law, but he welcomed it as an aspect of a modern polity, not because the British had brought it. That's one thing we need to be clear about. And the second thing is the legislation that the British passed for Ambedkar was never nearly enough. And he said that they never did anything that would actually upset and overturn the social economic power of caste elites in the Indian context. And that's a charge that he puts on the British throughout his life. If you read his submissions to Southborough, if you read his submissions to Simon, and during the Roundtable Conference, in fact, the first speech he makes in the first Roundtable Conference is a direct indictment of British rule and of all that the British refused and failed to do for the untouchables, especially. So I think he very clearly understood that the British will not cross certain limits. You can keep pushing the envelope to see how much they would cross, but it is not in their interest to do so. He makes that very clear. But he also realizes that they are trying to sort of retain their sense of control and hegemony, and in that context might listen to the claims of the minorities, including the so-called untouchables, for their own reasons. And he is determined to work that space to his advantage, which is what he does when it comes to the separate electorates. The British want separate electorates for Muslims and Dalits, not because they are committed to them being part of a democratic culture, but because that allows them a point of leverage against the Indian National Congress. And this is something Ambedkar realizes in the 1940s when they dropped the demand for the separate electorates for Dalits, when they refused to heed any of his suggestions for constitutional guarantees, leading him to anger, despair, and frustration. He says, now they don't need us. So they're not even interested in heeding what we have to say. So he's under no illusion as to what British rule is all about.
My question is something that came up when we were discussing history in the earlier lectures as well. And today, with your discussion of history, it is come back to me, which is where does Ambedkar stand with his ideas of history? Because we've discussed how he is someone who's very keen about methodology and so on. So, be it with the triumph of Brahminism, or how he writes about the history of the Shudras or the Untouchables, where does he where does he stand in this idea of viewing history, writing about history? Who are the historians he agrees with?
That's a very long and loaded question. I'm just going to look at the principle of it now. How did he understand history? One is, of course, that like many Indians of his time, history was not something that was only in the dim, distant past for him. Because any attempt to understand history was always anchored in something that had to be done in the present. So if a custom had to be challenged, if a law had to be reformed, the tendency was to go back and look at past law books, past commentaries, and say, this is not what Hindus did, or this is what Hindus did, and so on. So the argument was also always couched in terms of whether this is something that Indian history allows us to do, Indian society in the past has done, and so on and so forth. So history was never in the distant past. History was what was there in terms of its relationship to the present. So history was never back then. History was always part of what is now. That is at one level. At another level, history was also something that had to be understood in terms of how it refuses to answer anything about Shudra and Dalit existence. And you have to make history speak to those lives. And therefore, you have to read history in a very different way, which is what Ambedkar does with his book on the Untouchables. So you have to make history speak. So there's a certain reconstructivist aspect to how you understand history. The third thing is history cannot be seen as the ultimate in guiding present day conduct. Because Ambedkar makes a very famous statement during the Mahat Satyagraha, when people are constantly looking upon historical precedent, this is how it was done in the past. And he makes a very important statement that injustice has no tradition. So basically, you cannot fall back on tradition or history to endorse your actions in the present. You act in the present in terms of what the present demands and needs. Of course, history is part of that present in a certain way. But that part of the present, that part of the history which enters the present, has to be seen in terms of how you are trying to reconstruct the present. And this is something that he picks up from John Dewey. That's a very important thing from Dewey that influences his thought. Now, many historians that he reads and he works through are central to his own understanding of history. But I think Ambedkar did not see himself as a historian, core historian. He was a citizen, he was a thinker. The uses of history, the past, were important in as much as they helped him to reconceptualize and rework the present and the future.
In terms of electoral democracy, have we missed the opportunity to provide for social constituencies? For instance, today's electoral process only provides for representation through geographic constituencies. Did Ambedkar feels that with the coming of the constitutions, there was no need for separate electorates, or was it a compromise with the Gandhians in the Constitution Assembly that is continuation of the Pune Pact compromise?
Thank you. That's a very good question because I didn't have time to address it in my talk. Ambedkar did not think territorial or geographical electorates should be the way to go, that you demarcate constituencies on the basis of region. You also needed to have social electorates, which is that you also have to demarcate electorates in terms of specific social segments like labor, the Dalits and the Muslims and so on. But he wanted this done in very nuanced ways. And one of the ways was, of course, that you combine the territorial principle and the social principle by having both seats reserved for the minorities and the untouchables, and by devising an electorate in which Dalits alone will vote to elect Dalit candidates and so on. So this is something that he envisaged. It didn't come to pass. With the Pune Pact, we know what happened, that seats were reserved for the Dalits, and the election was to take place in 2 stages. Dalits would elect a panel of Dalit candidates first, and then along with non-Dalits, they would elect one from amongst those from that panel. And here, of course, there was no guarantee that whoever was favored the most by the Dalits would get elected by a joint electorate. And this is where Ambedkar realized to his great bitterness the limitations of the Pune Pact almost immediately after the 1935 elections. So I think he was very critical of it, and he wanted a reversal back to the separate electorates, which is not something that the British were willing to entertain. He felt that's your business with the Congress. We are not prepared to take a stand on that, and we are not going to use that to delay the transfer of power. And in and through the Constituent Assembly, and at one point, of course, Ambedkar is so frustrated that he says, I'm going to take my case to the UN, at which point is when he is invited to the Constituent Assembly. In the Constituent Assembly, you find that this is a point he finds it very, very hard to argue out and to convince the nationalists. His greatest opponent is Vallabhbhai Patel. And there's a very important book that's come out on those sort of debates and tensions in the Constituent Assembly by Wundru. Rajshekhar Wundru was written on this. But Ambedkar almost stages a walkout of the Constituent Assembly on this question. He tries to push it as much as possible, but he's outnumbered, and he is not sort of able to sort of bring that argument about constitutional guarantees and special electorates into the Constituent Assembly debates. And I think today we are reaping the ill effects of that in the very long term. So that's a question that continues to bother and Dalit leaders and Dalit thinkers.
Thanks so much. That was a great talk. I guess my question is at the intersection of what was happening in the world at that time in terms of the Soviet Union and how Ambedkar thought of the national question. So, I mean, this has become a topic of conversation that Ambedkar agreed in the creation of Pakistan because of like the oppression that Muslims would have faced, the Hindus essentially, and but the kind of the reasons given for the creation very much fell back on the basic tenets of Islam rather than taking up some of the ideologies of the national question that the Soviet Union was talking about. And of course, Ambedkar was very much influenced by Stalin. And when he died, he fasted for the entire day and everything. So I'm just wondering why he did not take the learnings from Soviet Union and apply that to the national question when it came to the partition.
See, if you look at the text that I had put in for today's reading, communal safeguards, you will notice that he does reference the right to national self-determination, which is at the basis of the Pakistan question.
Right.
And he does refer to that, and he refers to earlier histories to do with nationality, Renan and others in Pakistan or the partition of India. But I think here we need to think through his Pakistan book in terms of a very long engagement with the question of minority representation as such, which he starts with in 1928. It's a very long constitutional history. I won't have time to go into it. I will look at some of it in my lecture on nationalism. But basically, his problem is that the way the minority question had come to be identified with the Muslim League and created this sense of there being only one way of thinking about minorities, which is the way the Muslim League has done it, which he finds hugely problematic because he feels that they are demanding parity and weightage, which is not based on their particular social status, which is neither oppressed like that of the Dalits, neither is it sort of representative of the social situation of Muslims as it exists across India. So he is not happy with the sort of claims that the Muslim League makes, and he brings out a very different kind of representational politics to the table, which is what I've just spoke of in my earlier answer, territorial electorates plus social electorates, and the combination has to be different for different segments. So from that point onwards, he's very watchful of how the Muslim question overdetermines the Indian national movement's response to all other claims to representation and all other claims to statutory and constitutional safeguards. And he wants to think of the Muslim question in ways that would allow these various other demands to also be part of the argument. And when it comes to Right Pakistan's first edition, which is in 1940, he makes it very clear that this question has to be settled before any kind of question about the kind of society we wish to be can be thought about. Because the question of the so-called Hindus is only being thought of in terms of the Hindu-Muslim equation and not in terms of the Hindu caste, Hindu untouchable equation. And I think Pakistan has, the book Pakistan has lots of very problematic references and statements, which we shall look at later. It's very much a lawyer's argument for Pakistan. But Ambedkar steps back, and in 1945, he takes a different position, which is there as part of the appendix to Pakistan or the partition of India, which is also there in the essay that I have put here together. As for his being influenced by Stalin, that's something we have no real evidence for. People are making these statements. But as far as I know, I could also be wrong. But I think he was not particularly enamored of a Stalinist Russia, even on the question of national self-determination. National self-determination for him always had to do with democracy, always had to do with the way differences existed within the Indian social context. And I think he tried to come up with a conceptual model that was adequate to the Indian social context. And he did not seek to draw upon any particular tradition of thinking about it. So he was aware of all these traditions.
Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar says that in India, there is not a perfect democracy. Then what Baba Sahib Ambedkar think about another type of democracy is it?
He felt that democracy as a political system, in terms of the right to, all of us having the right to vote, all of us electing a government, works up to a certain point. But what will such a government be able to do if those who are elected also don't have a shared vision of economic and social justice? That democracy cannot amount to much. And he's talking on the basis of two examples. One is the example of what happened to European democracies between World War I and World War II, how they all collapsed and gave into fascism. And he felt that that was because in those societies, while you had political democracy, the question of economic democracy had not been sufficiently addressed, especially in Germany and in other parts of Central and Western Europe. When it came to India, and this is the second reason, he felt that parliamentary democracy to a certain extent can help us achieve a sort of political life where we all can discuss certain things together and come up with certain solutions. But at the same time, you need to have a system of rule, a system of constitutional norms by which you also ensure social and economic justice. Now, in the Constituent Assembly, he could not push that point beyond a certain limit. So at the end of the Constituent Assembly debates, when he presents the draft constitution, he says, unless you have social and economic democracy, and he didn't give us a blueprint as to how to achieve that. He knew some of it should be perhaps along the model of the socialist state. Therefore, he talks of collectivization, he talks of state ownership. But then he is also not sure if the socialist state is enough, because the socialist state does not always give room for liberty or practices political democracy. So he's not quite clear as to how that has to be worked out. But he points to the need to think of a new state system altogether, a new system of practical democracy altogether.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, thanks for your time, ma'am. So I have a question. How far we have gone in terms of eradication of caste compared to what Black people achieved in US? Do you have any insight on that? For example, like 40 years back, there were colored toilets, and a lot of people, even Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and a lot of people fought against this racism, and at least they got into power, and they're in good position now, the Black people. But still there are a lot of things are going on, like Black Lives Matter, and a lot of shooting happen targeting blacks and other stuff. But other than that, compared to our Indian casteism, how you compare the black achievement with our caste, the Dalits?
Yeah, it's a not an easy question for me to answer because I don't know all that much about African American concerns over a period of time. I know some things, but I do know certain things. One is that the system of positive discrimination or reservation that India has evolved um, has been considered by African American scholars to be a much better way of ensuring that different kinds of exploited and oppressed people find a position within government and in education. They think that that's been a very successful model. William Darrett, for example, the scholar, has written about this. They don't think it's ideal or it's achieved a huge amount, but I think in compared to what is available in the United States in terms of affirmative action, the Indian model is far more expansive, far more calibrated than the American model. That's one thing. The second thing is, as you yourself have pointed out, there's been a resurgence of violence against African Americans. And we all see that there's in terms of the economy, in terms of access to social resources, the color line is still very tight and it's held in place. There's still racism is very much part of the fabric of vast sections of American society, just as casteism is a part of the vast sections of Indian society. But I think in terms of debates about racism, debates about caste, there's been a certain political resonance in the Indian context, which I may be wrong, but perhaps which is not available across all political contexts in the United States. It's a very large country. I can't really speak for all of it. But I think the way Bahujan Dalit presence in national politics, in terms of their presence in the assembly, in terms of their presence in the legislature, because of reservation, has brought more Bahujan Dalit participation. I think personally, which has made differences in terms of the kinds of laws or the kinds of things you can do in public life. Again, it's not nearly enough to what is required, but it has certainly, say, in the southern states, for example, boosted the presence of the dominant caste in public life and political life, and brought in various other segments. Now, there are problems there as well, but I do think that some changes have been made possible. Socially and culturally, we still have a very long way to go, because I think social and cultural matters have a lot to do with the gender question. And unless anti-caste movements foreground the aspect of domestic, intimate relationships in a rich way, that might not actually come to pass. And that might not also happen if feminists do not address the whole question of caste in terms of what we seek by way of women's rights and women's emancipation. So from both ends, a certain conversation has to happen, which has begun to happen, but it also stops, then continues, stops, then continues. So this is something that's important.
Vanakkam, Dr. Geeta. Thanks a lot for the session. Is there any concrete effort taken by any of the political party after the independence to fight for the dual electorate system? Especially, I want to know about BSP and other parties, or communist or Dravidian parties, because until Gandhi lives, actually, he blackmailed to block this stuff. And is there any other parties took this effort and start continuing this effort?
I think Kanshi Ramji was very interested in pushing the agenda of the separate electorates, because his famous document called Chamcha Raj, where he basically says that under this present system, you only get Dalit Bahujans who can be chamchas, followers of the dominant party in question. And he did have a stake in pushing the agenda and thinking through it. The Tamil Nadu context, Vidudalai Sirthigal, the VCK has been debating and thinking through the need for bringing back the debate on separate electorates to the forefront. I don't think other mainstream political parties are invested in the question at all. And I don't think the debate has taken off beyond statements and arguments from the part of particular political leaders or particular political groups. It has not really been considered as germane to the way we do electoral politics.
Thanks, ma'am.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Geeta, for the lecture. I want to ask you if you think Ambedkar's perspective of the legislature of the time and legislatures of the posterity more hopeless than was necessary. And I draw this from Ambedkar's argument in Annihilation of Caste, where he says that a legislature mainly composed of high caste men will not pass a law removing untouchability, sanctioning intermarriages, and so on. So, and as we have seen, the Constituent Assembly has done it. So, I mean, in terms of Constituent Assembly, I would like to know if how much role did Ambedkar had in influencing the Constituent Assembly's decision to abolish untouchability or provide access to public roads, ensure equality. And second, yeah, following from that, the legislatures of the posterity have also brought in several anti-caste legislations. And as we know, most legislatures were largely composed of upper caste men. So what's your view on that?
Thank you very much. It's a very important and interesting question, because one of the things that you will notice even in 1945, when he writes the essay Communal Deadlock and the Way to Resolve It, he's extremely wary and not at all sure that a constituent assembly will do any justice to framing a constitution for free India. In fact, he says, why do you even need a constituent assembly? Now, his wariness comes from the fact that the members of the Constituent Assembly will be dominated by a caste Hindu majority. And even if others are present by way of being represented, whether Dalits or Muslims or Sikhs or Christians or women, that representation cannot count for much in the face of a caste Hindu majority. And he argues that in India, you don't have a political majority so much as a communal majority. Just by virtue of being Hindu, there is a likelihood that you will all think together in a certain way. Now, of course, I think part of Ambedkar's wariness is polemical. He's trying to make that argument just so that people will think more and realistically in terms of enhancing the presence of minorities in the Constituent Assembly. But part of it is also that his whole experience with the process of reform and with the process of the Pune Pact and what followed makes him extremely skeptical that a legislature which is controlled by the national movement, by the Congress party, can hope to do justice for any of the things that mattered by way of caste inequality and so on. Which is why he's also not very thrilled with just a statement of the fundamental rights. His first speech in the Constituent Assembly is precisely along these lines, that it's all very well to have fundamental rights, but how are we going to action them? That's more important, and so on and so forth. So I think he retains that wariness, he retains that sense of what can be achieved and what can be done. But I think what you find happening in the Constituent Assembly is that perhaps because it's a moment for change, there's a great deal of enthusiasm in discussing certain normative issues, especially to do with liberty and equality. So things such as public access and matters like that, which are already covered by the fundamental rights, are sort of passed. The abolition of untouchability is something that Ambedkar, of course, speaks for very eloquently, but also don't forget it's a Gandhian agenda. That abolition of untouchability is something that the Gandhians in the Constituent Assembly also pushed. But I think Ambedkar's manner of pushing it is different. He is still seeking constitutional guarantees. He's still seeking constitutional fiat to enforce Article 17. So that is not something that he is granted, just like he is not granted the separate electorates. So his contribution is unique and singular, but it doesn't quite work that way. As to legislatures passing other things, when it comes to intercaste marriage and so on, which is part of the Hindu Code Bill, there's a lot of interesting support for Ambedkar. Yes, undoubtedly. All the women in the Constituent Assembly support him. More or less all the members of the Madras province support him, though they are all not part of anti-caste groups. Several Gandhians support him. So it's a very, as you said, it's a very interesting mixed thing. While Ambedkar is watchful, he also, by consenting to be part of the Constituent Assembly, realizes that this is a situation that one needs to work with and see if one can improve. And he does that all his life. As law minister, he does that. As a Rajya Sabha member, he does that. So while remaining wary, he also remains open to what an elected legislature can achieve. But he doesn't let the elected legislature feel that just because it's managed to do something, that it has therefore achieved what he and others have sought for by way of social change. So he provides that very tense, contentious factor in parliamentary democracy, which is very important. If it doesn't have to get conceited and it shouldn't get self-congratulatory.
Dr. Gita, you're talking about collectivization of the land and redistribution and state ownership over the industry. Please elaborate.
So Ambedkar's sense of what is required by way of economic democracy is something that grows on him during his tenure as labor member in the Viceroy's cabinet. And he sees the extent of poverty, he sees the perils of private ownership. So when he prepares a constitutional document, States and Minorities, he speaks of what an ideal state should do, the independent Indian state should do, where he speaks of how the state should commandeer land and take over land from whoever holds it, pay them compensation, and then create these large collective farms on which everybody works and gets compensation from the state for working on them. This is his vision of collectivization of land. He also says that while there must be some room for the private sector, much of industrial life, especially that which is necessary for growth and development, which is crucial, should not be left to profit making or private ownership, but should be something that the state takes over. So States and Minorities is a document that you should be reading to get a more rich sense of this. He also talks of the need to make land available to Dalits and house sites and so on. That's also something that you will find in States and Minorities. So I urge you to read those documents.
Dr. Ambedkar reconciled two seemingly contradictory ideas of annihilation and democracy. Did he believe it was possible to annihilate something as mammoth as caste through democracy?
I think it's a complex task that he set him and he has set us, which is that caste annihilation is something that has to be done along the three lines that I pointed out: economic, social, and religious. And democracy is a very capacious ideal from which you set out in these three directions. Now, there's a tendency on our part to confuse democracy with practical political forms that such a democracy can take, but that democracy remains therefore mired in historical circumstances. But his very expansive definition of a democracy as a way of life, as conjoined, communicative, social existence, as social endosmosis, as mutuality, respect, affection, as discovering our humanity only in association with others. These are all, I think, values which he felt were the opposite of what the caste system has to offer. And you have to build those values. And those cannot only be built by democracy, practical democratic arrangements. Therefore, later on, he would turn to Buddhism, he would turn to ethics, he would speak of the need to reconstruct society, of us adopting a different way of life itself, and so on. Now, the project of annihilation, just like what it seeks to annihilate, is never one thing. The caste monster is very hydra-headed. It keeps changing shape, it keeps moving, and it keeps recreating itself. So for Ambedkar, therefore, the movement from democracy to Buddhism is necessary at one point. But there's no guarantee that he would have stayed only with Buddhism. He would have also gone on to do something else at some point in time. So therefore, within the broad ambit of democracy and fraternity, what all one might need to marshal to one's argument, one's practice, to annihilate caste is a problem that Ambedkar has left us with. So let's sort of see democracy in that rich, wide, expansive, ever renewable sense. Thank you.